everyone. I'm Lucia, and I'm going to be talking about how to give whip speeches. I am, unfortunately, not very good at time zones, which is why we had to reschedule this one. But I am better at whip speeches, so that's what I'm going to be talking about. So I actually have a PowerPoint ready. The good advantage of showing up to this workshop rather than waiting for the recording is that I do think that this is quite an interactive workshop, but also one that sort of takes you through how to structure a whip speech so that you can practice the skills on the go. So I am at times going to ask people for what thoughts they have. If not, no worries, because I can just, do it since I made the PowerPoint. But it would be good to hear what people's thoughts are as well. Also, feel free to ask questions at any point in time. I guess ideally just type them in the chat box. Okay. So let's start. All right, so how to give killer whip speeches, also known as the best speeches. So whip speeches are my favorite speeches in BP debating, and it is something that I hadn't really come across until I started doing BP, but I actually think that they are quite fun to do. So first, I want to sort of introduce people to why I think that whip speeches are fun, which is probably why people find them kind of intimidating at times. I think that whip speeches are actually the most fun speech in the round. In many ways, it's quite thrilling to be the person that walks in with absolutely nothing written down on a piece of paper and then eventually have to summarize the round. I think that they're also the most fun precisely because they are the most volatile. So overall, I think that the structure of a PM is always kind of going to be the same, even if the content is different. But the structure of a whip speech is something that varies round to round, and the content of the whip speech also varies immensely. So there's nothing determining what you have to do in a whip, which is why I think they're quite exciting speeches as a whole. But like more reasons why I like them. I think that overall whip speeches are like the power position in BP, insofar as I think that a good whip speech can determine not just the ranking of one individual person in the room, but rather the ranking of where everyone places in the round. A good whip speech doesn't make judges think that they're doing that particular ranking because of the whip, but a good whip speech can generally, I think, determine the rankings where people place in the round by shedding new light onto arguments that are already on the table. The other reason why I like good whip speeches, and this is, I think, a particularly useful position to master if you're going to an international or if you're preparing for a really big major, is that they're actually excellent for tournaments. Extension, I think, is the easiest way to guarantee that you win. Because if you give a really, really good extension and you beat the top half and also beat the other side because your extension is just like that good, then congratulations, you win. However, I think extension is actually quite a bad place to avoid a fourth, because if you don't have anything, then like you're kind of screwed, you don't have anything, and you're probably gonna fourth. I think that instead, although whip speeches, if you don't have an extension, whip speeches aren't going to allow you to win the round. A good whip can definitely allow you to avoid a fourth, which is why I think that in some ways they're a very safe position to have a very good speaker on, because avoiding the fourth is the main thing that you want to do at majors and at internationals. It isn't really about winning, given that if you take a first, you only get 1 point. Well, if you take a first, you get like some points, but if you take a fourth, you lose a bunch of points. Basically, taking a fourth is more costly than winning. So I think that that's the main thing that you want to be avoiding, to the removal of all the points that you earned with a lot of challenges in BP debating. The last reason why I really like whip speeches is because I think that in many ways BP is kind of like, it's not like tug of war. It's not like 3 versus 3 debating where it's just 2 teams and it's just how the arguments move back and forth. I think that BP debating is very strategic because there's so much happening in the round that you have to really think about how is it, given all of the pieces that exist on the table, how is it that you're going to manage to win? So I think that that's what whip speeches are excellent for. So I think that if you're someone who's very strategic and who is able to determine and define team strategy very well when you craft cases, then perhaps you should be trying whip speeches, because that's the kind of thing that is going to make or break your whip, whether or not you're actually utilizing strategy. So let's chat a little bit about what the aim of a whip speech is, because I think that this is a good way to start. I think that one of the main problems that people sometimes have basically I think that there's two main problems that people sometimes have when they go into whip speeches. I think one is that, as I mentioned before, they're very volatile. They tend to vary in structure and in content quite a lot between rounds, so they're kind of difficult to master. But I think that the second problem that people run into is that they can seem quite boring and repetitive, and people don't really know how to approach them, because you can't, in theory, add new content, and you have to respond to arguments that have already been on the table for like an hour. So a lot of the rebuttal that you're going to give maybe has already been said. So I think that that's why it's important to go back to what the aim of the whip speech is, because I think that although those are overall things people say about whips, they don't actually get to the heart of what they are. So I think that the aim of a whip is not to repeat everything that has been said in the round or to rebut everything, but instead what you're trying to do is to take a look at what has happened in the round before you started speaking and offer some form of new insight. That new insight can come via responses, because oftentimes your responses are new and are defeating arguments or shedding new light onto arguments that are already on the table, so that the judge can conclude that that's a bad argument and you're beating it. So you're shedding new insight by responses. By reframing and weighing, because again, that is adding new material to stuff that's already on the table. Given that two arguments exist in the debate, how is it that you, via weighing or via adding a particular frame onto that argument, are able to make sure that one argument beats the other one by adding that sort of extra new insight? You also can add new analysis to the extension, obviously, but I think that the most important thing that whip speeches do, and this is what I'm going to mostly focus the workshop, is around telling a story about how you win. I think that good whip speeches kind of talk about the important issues in the round, but great whip speeches explain to you why those particular things that you as a speaker are going through are something that determines why you win the round. I think that great speeches have a narrative force that drives them, and also something that when the speech is over, you aren't just like, yeah, you know, those are some good arguments. You're like, they have won the debate. Whip speeches offer you a sort of connecting thread across the disaster that has happened in the debate so far for an hour, and explain to you how those lines all lead to victory. So I think that essentially, as a whip speaker, what you aim to do is to take the battle zone that the debate is and draw a path to victory. I think that that is the most important thing. And I think that the easiest way to do that is to make sure that as a whip speaker, you have very clear strategic goals when you're going into a round. If you go in as a whip speaker thinking that your speech is going to be a disaster, it is very probably going to be a disaster, because you don't have a planned structure, because you don't know what you're trying to achieve. So if you don't know what arguments you need to win the round, then it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to communicate anything like that. So you have to have clear strategic goals, clear purpose, but also importantly, I think that whip speeches are where a lot of meta debating comes into play. I think that also communicating why you're doing the particular things that you're doing is important. So the easiest way to do that is to, you know, explain why is it that this particular clash is important to you winning the round and why you have won it, because that fulfills the twofold purpose of firstly winning a clash, but second, explaining to the judges why that is actually a debate-winning clash. So that's sort of the aim of whip speeches: offer new insight and draw a strategic path to victory. I think that, again, one of the things that I mentioned earlier about why people find it difficult to do whips is precisely because they don't have a very clear, cohesive structure. So I do think that that's something that's difficult, but also partly what makes whip speeches so valuable. So I'm going to sort of offer some commentary on the three most common structures that you see people utilize. The first one is going speaker by speaker. For the love of God, do not do this. It is horrifying to listen to as a judge, to someone who isn't just doing the sort of, oh, I'm going to talk about everything. Is no, you're being made to see every single thing that a speaker said in the round. I think it ends up being horrendously repetitive. It is not time efficient at all, and it means that you have to spend a lot of time taking notes rather than thinking about the debate. So for the love of God, don't do this. This is a novice technique. It's not good. The second one, and this is sort of a more common one, but I'm not going to talk about it. The second one that you can use is team by team. There's a really good workshop by Danny Dubois on YouTube that you can watch if this is a structure that you're more amenable to, but I personally think that it's not that good. Part of the reason why I think that it's not that great is because I think that overall it can also still be quite repetitive, because very frequently, even if closing and opening have different arguments, very frequently both of those arguments are trying to get at the same impact. So there are things that you could talk together under an individual clash. Sometimes closing runs a vertical extension, so they're running further analysis on something that opening already said. So I think that team by team can be a bit repetitive at times. And I think that it's particularly not very good for bench weighing, because basically you have to do a sort of like, and why did we beat opening? And then a very much in your face explanation of why your opening sucks, which I think is not very nice. And also sometimes borders on giving actual responses to your top half, which obviously you shouldn't do. So I don't think that team by team is necessarily the best structure. However, I do want to caveat that some people do find it very good. And obviously Danny is great at team by team structure. So if you want to learn more about that particular structure, I recommend watching his workshop on YouTube. However, and here's the important thing, if you're like, oh, Lucia, why are you making me sit through this if I am someone who really loves doing team by team structure, is that the structure that I think is the best one is also one that is useful to learn for other debate purposes, even if you don't want to use that particular structure. The one that I think is the best one is clashes structure. I think that clashes is actually the best way to summarize important stuff, to repackage content that has been said in the round, and to offer new insights. I think that particularly clash structure is the one that is the clearest in terms of determining and explaining to the panel why you have won. Because I think that it's like in team by team, it's very hard for the panel to, at the end of your speech, have in a sentence, be able to summarize why you win the debate. But I think that, because I think that maybe they can get sort of like, yeah, I guess they kind of beat the closing half. I think they kind of win that. But I think it's quite difficult for them to be able to, in a sentence, be like, this is why you win. Whereas I think that in clash structure, if you do it well, panelists are able to actually do that at the end of your speech. So I think that it is actually the best way to repackage new important stuff, and to also showcase, like shine a spotlight onto the content that you think wins you the round, so that the panel is able to repeat that during adjudication. So I think that this is the best structure. As I mentioned earlier, if you do team by team, I think that doing clashes and learning how to do them is also valuable, so stick around. And the reason why I think that is because overall, learning how to do clashes is vital in terms of identifying the most important issues in the round. And I think that if you're someone who has more experience at clash structure, then you're able to see what those issues are even before you walk into the room, which means that you're going to become better at prep time, and you're not going to waste time running irrelevant arguments, and instead you're going to get to the meat of the debate immediately. So I think that it's also something that's worth thinking about and practicing. So yeah, what are clashes and what do I mean by that? Clashes are big issues that are discussed in the debate. Overall, oftentimes in a debate, or rather always in a debate, multiple teams will talk about them, even if their arguments have different names. So on This House Would Ban Zoos, for example, you are obviously going to talk about animal rights, because that's something that all teams in the debate want to discuss, whether or not zoos are bad or good for animal rights. I think that another issue that they might touch upon is things like conservation, and lastly, probably some issues about like the educational value of zoos and whether that's worth or not worth compromising animal rights. Those are all things that teams on all benches and on either side of the debate are going to want to talk about. So they are big issues that are discussed in the round, but the important thing about a clash is that they're discussed by both sides. If you're going to talk about why you think that, you know, environmental damage is bad on a debate, it's very unlikely that anyone's going to actually contest that in the round. So even if you know environmental damage is important, it's not really a clash insofar as no one's disagreeing with you. So it's definitely not going to win you the round. I think that overall, in terms of clashes, you can often see what the big issues teams will argue about are likely to be, even from prep time. You probably know, again, on This House Would Ban Zoos, that someone is definitely going to oppose you if you run an extension about animal rights, given that the other side probably says that zoos aren't bad for animal rights. So you probably already know kind of like what teams are going to argue about. I think that overall, there's sort of two ways to identify clashes as a whip speaker. The first one is very much debate dependent. So it's sort of, what are big things that teams are talking about in the round, like the points that teams keep clashing on and arguing the most on. And I think that that's one really useful way to look at it, because very often the actual clash will be very debate dependent. Maybe in this debate, everyone agrees that animals don't have rights. So the debate is actually about whether or not this is good for humans, and it's good for that in its entirety. Like, that's the debate. Everyone just thinks that lions don't have rights. So it's very debate dependent. And in that case, obviously your clashes change, because now, even if you show that animal rights exist in your whip, that's a completely brand new argument that didn't exist before. So that's not something worth talking about. So they're basically big issues that teams all talk about. I think that the other way to identify this, and I personally like this one more, but I have been told by some people that they find it quite challenging. Questions that you need to answer in order to win the round. So when you look at the motion, there's always on either side questions that you need to answer in order to show the judge why you win. So for example, in policy motions, normally there's going to be a question about whether or not the policy works. There's also going to be a question about whether or not the policy is beneficial. And there's probably also going to be a question about whether or not the secondary impact of the policy is worse than the potential benefit of the policy. So like, this house will legalize drugs. Can you actually do it? Probably. Is it going to have a positive effect? Probably. Is the positive effect of legalizing drugs worth the secondary conflicts that arise out of legalizing it? So I don't know, if the other side goes like, oh, there's going to be more war and cartels and stuff, you have to show that it doesn't, right? So I think that there's also questions that you need to answer positively for your side to win the round. Because if you prove that it's possible, that it's going to be good, and that, you know, it's not only going to be good for drugs and healthcare, it's also going to be good for like criminality and other issues, then you've definitely won the round. Equally on the other side, if you prove that it isn't doable, that it's not going to be good, and that it will create greater problems than the one that is attempting to solve, then you probably win the round. So I think that that's another useful way. Given that these are the questions that I need to answer to win the round, how can I make arguments in prep time to address those? And then you just can make your whip speak based on those. But again, some people find the question thing a little bit difficult to wrap their minds around. And I think that in that situation, something that I found particularly insightful when I was prepping with someone who does it, like, what are people going to argue about, is to try and think, what are the most likely things that people are going to argue about, and try and figure out your clashes based on that, and then obviously vary depending on the debate. I think that one of the problems with clashes is that obviously I can talk about them all day, but it is quite difficult to sort of visualize what they are and what they look like unless you are in an actual debate, precisely because they vary so much with motions. So the thing that I thought would be good is to just go through some WUDC motions from this year, and to just see what clashes we might potentially do for that particular round. So as I said, feel free to just kind of like shoot me with whatever, where is the chat function? Chat. There we go. Yeah, so as I said before, if you have any questions, just kind of like shoot them in the chat and I will answer. Or any suggestions. Wait, let's try a slightly different thing. Yeah, there we go. Okay, it doesn't want to do the thing. Okay, whatever, I will just kind of like look back and forth. But yeah, so if you have any questions or suggestions or whatever, we'll go through them. So the first one, this is, I think, quite a straightforward economic policy motion, which is why it was one of the early rounds. So this house supports the rapid global elimination of both tariff and non-tariff barriers to free trade. I think this is quite a classic one. So I think that overall, if I was prepping this, I would probably think that the overall question, I'm not very good at economics, but in prep time, I would probably think something like, the overall question of this debate is probably one about whether or not this is good or bad for global economies. So that's the overall question of the debate. Does it help or hurt economies? And if I prove on proposition or on government that it does actually help economies, then it's probably something that we should do. I think that then there's multiple different ways in which it could benefit or hurt economies. I think one could be, for example, the effect on local industries, and whether it creates jobs in those industries or destroys them. It can be about what happens not just with jobs, but also with small local industries themselves. So what happens to, you know, Mexican sneakers when you have American sneakers coming in because of free trade, and whether it's worth to instead do protectionism, or whether it's better for, like, if the Mexican sneaker industry exists, for it to die so that we can specialize in something that we're actually better at. So I think that the effect on local industries is definitely something that people are going to argue about. I think that the other big one is there's probably going to be a lot of talk about whether there's going to be an overall increase in trade itself, just because I do think that there probably is going to be. So I think that on Gov you can argue that it's going to be good that there's more trade, on Up you can say that it's worse. I think that the last thing that people might talk about is also about whether or not it's going to have some sort of regional effect, or impact regional economies, as in, like, is it better for there to be a small advantage with trading with countries from your own region, because, like, you know, you have interests that are similar, so you're more likely to form blocks of trade, and that's better? Or is it better to, instead of having those sort of like individual regional blocks, to have sort of undisputed free trade everywhere? So, like, I think that overall this is probably not going to be super good for blocks like the European Union, insofar as if the whole world has free trade, then there's not really that much of an economic benefit to economic unions or like ASEAN. So I think that that's something that probably teams are also going to talk about in the debate. So I think that overall then, as a WUDC speaker going into this round, let's say that I am right and this is what teams talked about, but this is something that I just like think that teams might potentially talk about. So as a WUDC speaker, you go into the round being like, okay, Dana, the overall question in the debate is whether or not the rapid global elimination of both tariff and non-tariff barriers to free trade is going to be beneficial or hurtful towards global economies. What I am going to show you is that overall, for all global economies, it's going to be beneficial. And I'm going to show you that there's going to be a benefit in three ways. Firstly, it's going to be beneficial to local industries. Secondly, there's also going to be a huge increase in trade in a way that we see as positive. And lastly, we think that also there's going to be a really good regional effect for reasons. So I think that then overall, what you have achieved with this class structure is you have directed the panel towards what you think the big questions in the debate are. So this is the big question. And you have also pointed them directly to how you are answering that question. And therefore, at the end of the round, when the panelists go away and talk, someone's like, who won? And you're like, I think that closing government won the debate, because I think that they showed very clearly how is it that they massively benefit all economies. And I think they show this in three ways. So it's already really, really easy for the panel to follow your story, rather than to be like, I think that they beat OG because of this, and I think that they beat OO because of this other reason, which is more confusing and harder to follow and articulate. So I think that overall, this is kind of it. Obviously, let's say that no one talked about the regional effect thing, and instead people talk about the erosion of culture. Then you can replace that particular clash with something else, and on prop you can be like, we also think this is going to be wonderful because we support a more globalized world rather than one where we are separated by nations and different cultures. And we think that the best way to reach acceptance is to, you know, trade goods with each other. So I think that then you can just like replace one for the other. But overall, I think that these are sort of things that even from prep time, like I think maybe I sat this debate out actually, I can't remember. But overall, it's something that you can definitely think about before the round even happens. So let's try to see what happens with another one. But before that, I think that there's some questions. Yeah, so the first question is like, what happens when debates are super messy? And I think that in those situations, well, the person asking has seen to some success, the WUDC speaker just grab one big impact and sort of explode this. I think that overall, that's definitely something that you can do. So I think that particularly this debate is, for example, in this debate, I think that it can get generally quite messy, just because, you know, whether there's an overall increase in trade, or rather the overall effect on local industries is very likely going to massively vary depending on the economies interacting. Equally, the regional effect is very likely going to massively vary depending on the particular region, whether there's already existing links. So I think that the answer to two of these questions can probably be, it depends. And I think that that's also something that you as a WUDC speaker need to see and identify. As a WUDC speaker, if you're like, okay, no one is winning either of these clashes, then I think that as a WUDC speaker, part of your job is precisely to make them a wash, so that you can say the biggest impact in the debate, like, we don't care about the effect on local industries. It's going to be good for Haiti. It's going to be terrible for Mexico. It's going to be good for Thailand. It's going to be awful for Nigeria. And we also think that the regional effect massively varies. So we don't think that this is something that you can win the round on. However, the reason why we think this is still going to overall massively benefit economies is because we think that there's going to be a huge increase in free trade. So I think that equally, what you are doing with your class structure is just sort of grabbing what teams are already talking about and just manipulating it into an outcome that you want that still shows why you won. I do think that this is something that can be quite doable. And I think that in messy rounds is actually something that's worth doing. I think there's two ways to win messy rounds. Either A, make everyone look really messy and then be like, we have one thing that we have won. Or B, just, you know, be very clear, because that's the thing that judges are going to remember. They're not going to remember the incredibly messy, even if beautifully impacted, of the speech. They're very likely going to remember a very clear, clean speech. So I think that in messy rounds, it's definitely something that's worth doing. The other question that people say is there a good note-taking structure you can suggest which we can use to track the clashes across this? I'm actually going to talk about notes and how you ought to structure your internal clashes in a bit, so we'll come to that later. So in the meantime, let's try a different one. And I think for this one, I sort of use the what do you think teams are likely to argue about way of thinking about clashes, but to try the other one, because again, I think that both of them can be useful. What do you need to show in order to win this debate? So this helps to allow children to sue their parents for religious indoctrination. I think that there's a couple of questions that as a government, you need to be able to answer in the debate. I think the first one is whether or not indoctrination is a harm. So I think that although it sounds kind of obvious, you probably need to show that it has negatively impacted children's lives in order for them to be able to sue their parents because of it. And I think that the second thing that you probably want to show is whether or not the parents are actually responsible for that indoctrination and therefore should be held liable in a court of law. Because if you are responsible for harm and that harm was done deliberately, and then in those situations, I think that it's valid to sue someone. Obviously, you can disagree with me and think that there's different things that I can show, but I think that it's pretty compelling to just be like, look, panel, at the end of this debate, we have shown you that there's been immense amounts of harm that has been caused to children, that harm has been done knowingly and deliberately by parents. So we think that at the end of the day, we should hold the parents responsible for the choices that they made and the harm that they knowingly and deliberately caused to their children. If you know the harm that you're causing, then you're responsible. If you don't know the harm, then you're negligent and you should still be able to be held to account. So I think that, again, that's sort of like a compelling way in which you can frame it. And I think that this one is just kind of looking at the motion and thinking, what are the things that I need to show for the panel to believe that I am indeed winning? And I think that to win, those are two things that you can try and show the panel. And again, I think that once you have it like that, it's very likely that teams are going to argue a lot about this. They're very likely going to argue about whether or not like religious indoctrination is actually like a good or a bad thing, whether it is indoctrination in the first place. It's very likely that they're going to argue about whether it's the parents' fault or whether it's not the parents' fault, and you can hold them responsible for something that they also had no control over and no consent over, and it's more like the overall church structure that you should be suing rather than the individual parent. So I think that those are also things that teams are very likely to argue about. So even in thinking, what do I need to answer in order to win? You're already thinking about things that teams are very likely to talk about and to mention in the round. So I think that that's also something that is very much worth doing. To try sort of another one before we go on to sort of note-taking structure, etc. This house believes that the Mexican government should adopt measures that enable one cartel to monopolize the drug market. So I think that for this one, it's actually a very good example of one where teams can talk about like 70,000 things. I think that overall, there's probably going to be in this debate some discussion about things like whether or not this is good or bad for drug consumption and for healthcare, whether this is something that's going to lead to more drug addictions or less drug addictions. I think there's very likely that there's going to be a lot of talk about whether or not this is going to increase cartel violence or reduce cartel violence. I think that equally, you can talk about government corruption. For example, a team on the government may say that there's actually less of an incentive to have corruption in government now because you as the main cartel gain absolutely nothing, given that you're already talking with the state, and why government corruption is like the bigger problem in Mexico. Equally on the op, you can say that government corruption actually gets worse when there is one individual cartel and that eventually becomes impossible to control, versus at least now where there's like competing interests or something. And I think that the last one is you're very likely going to have a lot of chat about the comparative, which is likely going to be embedded into these three ones, because, you know, that's good debating. But maybe the other side comes up with like a wild card and they're like, we wouldn't do this, but we would like legalize drugs or invade Mexico, in which case it becomes probably a different thing in itself. So I think that in this one, this is the kind of situation in which in prep time, you probably can see that there's going to be discussion about a lot of these things. So the individual question is just, which one do I prioritize? Which one is more important? And again, it's very, very likely that, for example, your extension is going to only talk about one of these. Maybe your extension, because I think that the first two are the most obvious ones. So maybe as closing government, your extension actually talks about government corruption and how this mostly fixes that problem. And given that that is the most important thing, that's the thing that you want to focus on. In which case, that's the thing that you want to give the most meat to in your whip speech. And you want to either make this ones a wash or show that you kind of like win them, but that this is still the most important thing. The last one, I think, I can't remember the slides, but yeah, the last one is this house believes the feminist movement should support the narrative that beauty does not matter over the narrative that all bodies are beautiful. So I think that for this one, you can first of all ask whether or not the statement is true. Does beauty matter? Because I think that on government, if you show that beauty doesn't matter, therefore why is the feminist movement pushing a narrative that doesn't work? I think that the second one that you can ask is whether or not the narrative helps or doesn't help women. And I think that's obviously quite a big clash in the round. And I guess that the last one can also be something like, what is the best way to change the fashion industry? So I think that probably like does beauty matter becomes kind of like a weird principle clash. But if you show that it helps women on your side, then you probably do very well in the round insofar as like, this helps women with self-esteem issues. It helps women with like beauty induced healthcare problems, like it's less likely that you're going to use like skin whitening creams, etc. So it can help women. An alternative, and I think that a different question is also just like, what is the best way to actually engage and talk to the fashion industry and eventually change it? Because one of the main sources of toxicity is the fashion industry itself and the kind of incentives that it has. So do they have more, or is it easier to advocate against them when you have this beauty doesn't matter stance, or when you have the other one, which one allows for more dialogue, for more conversation, or for more change? So I think that these are, again, all questions that you're likely to answer. So I think that as a whip speaker, if you show that it doesn't, if you show that it definitely helps women, then you're very likely winning. Equally, if you show that you are the one who is actually most likely to be able to change the fashion industry in a positive way, then it's very likely that you also win the round. If most of the teams agree that that is the source of a lot of issues in society. So I think that, again, thinking about it in terms of questions, what do you need to answer in the debate? You can start doing that since prep time, and you just kind of like either delete questions or change them, depending on how the round is going. So I think that there was a question about this earlier in terms of note taking, and I think there's a question about this now. that sometimes it can get really messy in terms of comparing matter to what the other teams say and where to clash. So I think that I'm going to basically talk about this now, like how do you do the intra-clash structure good. And also the other question someone has is like, is it good to web your extension separately and then resolve existing clashes, or should you integrate your extension into your question clashes? I think you should integrate your extension into your questions clashes. I would hate it if someone was like 3 clashes and then I'm going to talk about my extension. Your extension is the reason you win the clashes. Obviously, maybe your extension doesn't address a particular clash, but if it does, it should be within that clash. And you know, you should never do clashes that don't talk about your extension. As in, like, let's go back to the example of like the war on drugs. Again, your extension talks about government corruption. So you're probably not going to talk about your extension on these 2, but in this one, you're definitely going to talk about it. So this is going to become more clear when I talk about this. So yeah, one of the big problems I think that people also have, in addition to first identifying clashes, and it's partly why I think that web speeches are, again, quite challenging sometimes, or why I also found them super hard and weird to structure, is because there isn't really a clear-cut way to explain how to do clash structure. Everyone's just like, oh, I guess just like have it in clashes, but then it becomes hard, like, where do I do responses? Where do I do my extension? Where do I put everything? But I actually think that there's quite a straightforward, easy way to think about intra-clash structure. So I'm gonna give you my secrets now. As I said, they have kind of like a less clean structure. And I think that many people also find it more challenging than, for example, team by team, because in team by team, it's very clean. You can just go like normal responses that are, you know, structured. And then I guess I can talk about my extension after that. So it's a bit like a deputy speech in many ways. But I actually think that secretly clash structure, as I said, is very straightforward. And I think that if you listen to most good web speakers, you'll see that they actually follow quite a similar structure to this. So first one is you have your clash. You would announce this so that people are able to follow you. A really important thing, I think, in web speeches is you have to be clear and structured, because precisely because they have no structure, it's extremely easy for anyone to get lost. So obviously you first go to like, okay, so now talking about my first clash, whatever. So the first thing that I think that you should deal with in your clash is what the other side said on this particular clash. So if the op and closing opposition had any material on this particular clash, here is where you would refute them. And this is just done by doing sort of like normal refutation, however you prefer to do it. So, okay, so on this particular clash, opening opposition told us the following. I have 2 responses to this, or we as a team have 2 responses to this, bam, bam. So there you're sort of dealing with their material on this. Then after this, you would talk about your extension. So after seeing that, we don't actually think that the opening opposition reasons for this particular situation actually happen. So what does my partner instead tell you on this? What we tell you is whatever. The reason why we think this is more compelling is because blah, blah, blah. So I think that overall what you're doing here is firstly, you're dealing with their material and showing why you don't think their material wins the clash. So that's the first thing that you're doing. And then you're moving to a second bit, which is what do we add on this particular clash, and explaining why your material is important or adding more analysis onto it. I think the last thing that then all clash structure should have is weighing and meta debating. So I think that once you have the, they said this, here are my responses, here's what we said, adding more meat onto it. What does this mean? And I think that then you explain what overall that analysis means and why you have won the clash and why the clash matters. So I think that first you would do some weighing in terms of, so when you're looking at who won this particular clash, I think that you have to remember that, I don't know, the analysis that opening op gave you actually only applies to a very, very small number of people. And we have given you a frame that shows that those are a minority of individuals. Whereas the analysis that we gave you in extension actually applies to the vast majority of individuals, which is why our impact applies to everyone, which means that it's more important. I think that overall, this means that we have won this clash, which we think is a particularly important clash because, I don't know, reasons. It is literal death and murder. I don't know, maybe that's the clash. But I think that then when you look at the structure, it is basically, they said this, here are my responses. We said this, here are more reasons for this. what does this mean? So weighing. Why do you think, why is therefore the stuff that we said more important than the stuff that they said? And lastly, why does winning, the fact that we have won this clash means that we have won the debate? So I think that overall, it's quite actually like a secretly quite easy structure. And again, if you look at most really good WUDC speakers, I think that most of them have a very similar structure to this. I think that the important thing to note, and someone was asking a question about this, is like, oh, what happens when like my extension doesn't deal with this particular clash? Is that not all aspects are always present. So for example, let's say that in a debate, the opening opposition and the closing opposition just had nothing really on this one particular clash. So then in that situation, you'd be like, okay, so first my clash on something. Firstly, my clash on capitalism. The opposition actually didn't have that much material on this, but I think that what my partner told you is incredibly important. There's 3 things that we told you on this, and you sort of like go over them, add more analysis. This is the most important thing in the round, and the fact that we have proven this harm means that we won the debate. So then you're just doing what do we say and adding more analysis, and then doing meta-analysis and weighing as to why that is the most important clash that should win you the debate. Equally, maybe you don't actually have any material, but I think that then you just do responses, right? And then an explanation of why your responses mean that it takes them out of the round. So that can look like, okay, so first on capitalism, they told you this argument. We gave 3 responses. In addition, a bunch of those responses, just the other speaker, the CO extension, said absolutely nothing. So we're assuming that the criticism stands. Add more meta. At the end of the day, what does this mean? It means that overall their case cannot stand because reason. But also, we actually don't think that this is the most important clash of the debate. We think that at the end of the day, this is like less important than other things. So you can simultaneously be like, we won this clash because of responses, but also we don't even think that this clash is most important. Obviously, the second one isn't necessarily always strategic. That's more like a decision that you make as an individual in the round. But yeah, not all aspects are always present, but fundamentally, you want to think about it as like Lego blocks that you can always sort of stack if necessary. So if they have an argument about this and your extension is about this, then you have all of these 3 things present, but you can remove and take away pieces depending on what's happening. Specific rebuttals to CO get diluted. Suggest some ways to prevent that. Yeah, so I think that when you're CG, I will make a sort of brief preface to that. Very frequently, there's two scenarios in the world, right? One is where the CO extension actually fits really well with the clashes, and the other one is where the CO extension doesn't fit with your clashes. Obviously, it's kind of too late to change that. So I think that in that situation, in those 2 situations, I think there's a couple of ways to deal with it. Firstly, if the CO extension deals with your clashes, the thing that I do when I do clashes is I do like little stacks of paper for each clash. So for my first clash, I would have like a little stack of paper, and I would just have like a little stack. So if the CO extension appears, then I would literally just like in a separate sheet of paper, write it down, write my responses to it, and then just insert it into the appropriate place. And because it's like free-flowing paper, it's relatively easy to do. So I think that that's one way to highlight it, or rather, one way is to just kind of like insert it into your existing clashes if it fits nicely. In terms of ways to highlight it, because I do think that it's very true that it sometimes gets diluted, I think there's 2 ways that you can highlight it. Firstly, like literally say this in the debate. I think that very frequently it gets lost because you're not explicitly saying that you're responding to a CO extension. So I think that you want to very verbally assert that you are responding it. But secondly, I think that you want to move the clash to the top. I think that's a very easy way to sort of immediately deal with it, to just be like, firstly, on my first clash, and here I want to deal with the extension that we just heard out of closing opposition. And that way is like very immediate, very fresh in the judges' minds. The other way that I think that's one thing that you can do. The second one, the second scenario, which is the extension doesn't actually deal with anything, I think you just give responses separately. In that case, your structure would look something like, okay, so I'm going to talk about 3 clashes, 1, 2, 3, but before anything, I just want to respond to the extension that we just heard out of the previous speaker. And then you give your responses in like a minute or 2 minutes or however long you want to spend on it. But yeah, I do think that, again, CG is a particularly, I think in my opinion, it's the hardest position in DP debating, because you have essentially only one speech to respond to closing opposition who have two speeches to respond to yours. So I think that in that scenario, your best bet is to respond immediately, but also do a lot of the sort of weighing of why you won the debate for reasons that are independent than the arguments presented by CO. Yeah, so I think that that's the best way to try it. So I think what I want to do is also sort of show how the structure looks, but also particularly I want to show you that like it is actually something that all speakers do, and I think that it's very easy to do once you sort of get the hang on it. So let's say that we're closing opposition on this house believes that this house would ban facial recognition technology. So I think that overall, kind of like what I said earlier, one of the questions that you probably want to answer is, does the technology actually work? Because I think maybe prop can just argue it doesn't work, so let's just ban it. It's like awful. So yeah, so in this debate, in this clash in particular, does it work? In this clash in particular, opening government tells you that it is unreliable and therefore it often convicts the wrong person. I have three responses to this. One, we can improve it. CCTV used to be really bad. Second, it's just one tool in the toolbox. We don't have to use it for absolutely everything. We just think that occasionally it can be useful. And in those situations, it's good if the technology that can solve a crime isn't banned. But thirdly, it is actually more reliable than alternative technology, or things like eyewitnesses, because eyewitnesses are often subject to things like racial biases, are unreliable, have very poor memory. CCTV is often grainy, whereas facial recognition technology is actually better than a lot of the alternatives. So overall, we don't think that the reasons that OG provided are sufficient grounds for a ban. But also, it overall does work, and that's what my partner told you in extension. 3 things that she told you about why they do work. In conclusion, this technology works, but even if it didn't, that's not a reason to ban it, but just to invest more in it. Prop has to contend with the fact that this works. They didn't. So most of their arguments lose a ton of weight, given that this is actually a technology that is functional. So I think that then what you're doing is just basically, here's what opening government said. Here are my responses to it. And then also, here's what we said. And in conclusion, overall, it works. It's no reason for a ban. But it basically has the same structure of like, they said, we said, comparison. Why is it that given what both teams said in the round, our side is winning? And also sort of like a conclusion in terms of what this means in the meta of the round. So in this meta round, what it means is that because they didn't show that it didn't work, a lot of their arguments are just not powerful anymore and they shouldn't win them the round. The second thing that I think you can talk about is like, does it lead to more crime or does it solve crime? So opening government, again, claimed that leads to wrong convictions and that criminals can use the technology anyway. So I think that in that situation, again, 2 responses, now criminals still use it, but we can't. It also, as I mentioned earlier, leads to worse convictions on the op. Closing government also had some material on this. They said that the real danger is governments using it for bad things. But again, 2 responses. Firstly, governments are under heavy scrutiny with facial recognition technology, and it is very likely that you're going to be able to hold them to account. People care a lot about their privacy, which means that the government regulation and how they're utilizing facial recognition technology is likely going to be very good. And already, more regulation means that it becomes more transparent. So you have to get a warrant, for example, to utilize facial recognition technology. It's not something that absolutely everyone can have access to. So what we need is not a ban, but rather to regulate it. They needed to show why that regulation was impossible. They didn't. The last thing that, so overall, we think that they didn't show how is it that it leads necessarily to worse crime. Opening opposition obviously had some like really good stuff on this, and they said that it's useful to capturing and identifying people. But here are the specific bits that my partner added in the debate. And let's say that you added specific mechanisms. So although we think that opening up did a very good job in terms of identifying the impact, we think that overall my partner, I think, gives you the specific mechanisms by which we actually identify and capture criminals. Here are the 3 things that she told you. So again, if you look at the structure, it's basically just like opening government said, here are 2 responses. Closing government said, we have some responses. And then what does our side tell you? So our side tells you that it is used for identifying people and some bench weighing in terms of what you're specifically adding. And I think that then your conclusion to this is, overall, we don't think that it leads to more crime. We think that it helps prevent crime. So that's a reason why we should keep it. Last clash, let's say that there's also a conversation about security versus privacy. And here's where I want to deal with like the main extension that came out of CG, which is that this is a huge violation of privacy. Some responses. Firstly, fuck privacy, security matters more. Second, we trade off privacy all the time. If you don't like having your privacy violated, burn your phone. But also, and here is what we told you in extension, is that it isn't just about security. It's also about many, many other things like phone screens, safer doors, identifying medical issues. So it's super important that we keep researching this technology. So it has a role beyond crime in terms of making people's lives actually better. So even if you think that the proposition teams have shown you that there is an increase in crime, you have to contend with the fact that it isn't just this technology for criminals that we're banning. We're banning this technology in every single field, and we think that's something terrible. And in our extension, we told you about why, you know, it has many, many other potential uses that we think are incredibly valuable and we shouldn't stop. So again, with this one, it's just they said responses, and then sort of how we fit into the round and why that is important, why that means that you won that clash and why that clash is important to the overall meta of the round. So I think that then when you look at it, you're sort of slotting what all the teams said in the round. You're talking about what opening government said and about why you beat them. You're talking about opening government and closing government because both of them talk about a similar clash. And lastly, you're also talking about like closing government individually and about where your own extension fits in. Let's assume that this is like your extension. I don't think it's actually like a wonderful extension, but let's assume that that's your extension, right? So then you're probably spending a fair bit of time talking about this particular clash. So I think that then overall, that I think makes it a lot easier in terms of how to address this. I want to particularly highlight how I think that then you take notes for these kinds of things. So what I normally do when I'm whipping is I have sort of like one sheet of paper where I write sort of the arguments that, I don't know, let's say that I'm like CO. I would write, yeah, we're CO in this motion. So in that situation, I would write sort of the arguments that came out of opening government, but you don't flow them completely. You just kind of like write them shorthand. So like really quick notes on the case. And then I would also write like on a separate, or rather like in another area of that piece of paper, sort of what the opening opposition ran, but that's basically just so I know that we shouldn't run those things. And then lastly, when I talk about CG, I also kind of like have it on that piece of paper as well. So then I am able to sort of grab and slot them into my particular clashes. And then I have that sort of big debate sheet, what's happening in the round. And in addition to that, I have my like little stacks of paper. So after PM, I'm like, okay, so I think that I have like 2 of the clashes that I'm going to talk about. Here we go. And you start constructing them. And it is within your like stacks of paper that you would actually make the clash. So for each clash, I will have like a little stack of paper, probably like 2 or 3 sheets. So for that one, I would do just sort of like the clash in big letters. Then the first sheet to just be things that other teams have said, which means that also you have a lot of space in case that the closing government is actually talking about this particular clash. So you can have opening government and then closing. Then second sheet, I would probably do sort of what we said. And then the last sheet is just big letters impact. I particularly find sort of writing down particular words that I want to highlight in my impacts useful. So I tend to have one particular sheet for that. So then I have my little stack. And again, if closing government's extension is in that particular clash, then I would either just like place it right on top, a sheet that has my responses on it, or sort of slide it between the pages. So that's what I normally would do. And again, the sort of master sheet isn't a like proper note-taking tool in the same way that you take notes as when you're judging. It is just like really shorthand things to remember what other teams in the round have said. Equally there, I would not normally have like the full argument written down, but I'd just be like, that's like a really important thing that we definitely need to respond to. So I would write that down, and then I would just kind of like scratch it when I have already dealt with it. So that's more or less the sort of structure that I use for note-taking during clashes. Okay. So now like I just want to take a step back in terms of what overall we learned from these 3 clashes, right? It doesn't work. It doesn't work. Facial recognition technology does work. It does stop crime, and we think that overall the value that it adds is greater than the privacy that it violates. So then let's take a step back, and I want to sort of bring it back to something that I said at the start, which is that I think that web speeches are really, really useful because they tell a story. So the question is, what's your story? And I think that then the story is, it works, and most of the harms can be regulated against, but we lose out on some big, big benefits. It is an incredibly valuable tool in dealing with crime when otherwise criminal organizations would use it without us being able to do anything about it. And it gives us immense technological potential in terms of improving quality of life, which means that we shouldn't ban it. I think that the beauty of clashes is that they give you a very clear story. And the story is, it works, which means that we can use it in useful ways. It helps us catch criminals, and it has immense potential for improving human life in ways that we cannot even fathom at this moment. So it's not something that we should remove, and it's not something that we should ban. So I think that it gives you like a really easy way for judges to be like, oh, okay, that's their story, that's why they win, but also for yourself to be able to be very clear about why you think your team has won the round. Do people have any questions in terms of sort of like clash structure and how they do them for this one? I'll check in a bit, but in the meantime, I will keep talking because I love the sound of my own voice, but mostly because I think it's hopefully helpful. I think that that's sort of, I think that's very useful to keep doing across your clash structure, is to keep doing that sort of like hinting back to the story. So I would say that part of hinting back to the story happens here at the last step of the clash structure when you're talking about like, why is this important and why you won? That's highlighting your story. But it also happens in the conclusion. And I think that clash structures give you like a really easy, beautiful way to conclude, which is just going through each clash and answering them. So at the end of the day, panel, we think that this technology works, and we think that the benefits of using that technology, both to catch crime, but also for many, many other ways, things that improve quality of life of individuals, are immensely beneficial, and therefore it's not a technology that we should ban. So I think that it's like, bam, 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 it works, it catches criminals, it helps with other things, fuck privacy. So I think that overall, that's sort of a story that then the panel has a very easy time identifying. So hopefully that was at least semi-clear in terms of how to do a clash structure, and in terms of some like extra tips for whips that I think are useful. The first one is go in with a plan. As I said at the beginning, whip speeches are strategic. So when you go into a whip speech, you should have a reason why you're having each clash be that. It shouldn't just be like, oh, I guess I have like, there's something that I need to talk about. But it should more be, okay, I am gonna do this with this particular clash. I'm gonna like rebut them and take down the arguments. Then with my second clash, I'm gonna show why our extension is beating the argument. And then on my last one, I'm just gonna minimize the impacts that closing opposition has and be like, they are not important, they're completely out of the round. Equally, like if, let's say your extension deals with everything because your opening government stood up and said nothing, in that situation, your plan is like, okay, so I'm gonna win all of these clashes, but the particular 2 ones that I wanna put the most fire behind are these 2, because I think that my partner did like a banging job analyzing these 2. They didn't really say that much about this last clash. So for that one, I'm just gonna like add some analysis, but also I'm gonna make sure that I say that these are the 2 most important ones. So again, it's about going in with a plan and thinking about why you're saying the things that you're saying. The second one is, I think that, as I said earlier, clashes are, or rather web speeches are the best way to not get a fourth. And I think that the easiest way to not get a fourth is to kick the weaker leg. So as a team, if your partner, who you love very much, and obviously partners forever, but also didn't say the extension, and now you're currently losing to teams that you don't think that you should be losing to, just pick a team. Because you don't actually need constructive, and you can remind everyone that Harish says that rebuttal should count as constructive material in your whip speech if you want. But the main thing is, I think that in a whip, what you can do is just be like, okay, whatever, we don't have an extension, but I think that we can definitely beat opening up. So just pick a team and destroy them. Spend your entire whip just like showing why you beat them. And I think that that way you guarantee yourself at least a third. So you're at least getting a point. So I think that's why whip speeches are in many ways the best way to not get a fourth, because you can just pick a team and be better than that team. The other thing that I think is useful is if one team is just like absolutely, completely, utterly destroying you, and there is no way that you think that you can in 7 minutes turn back the tide, you know, say a token thing, but fundamentally you don't need to win every debate. So I think that in that situation, secure the second and just be like, okay, yeah, whatever. Some things on closing opposition, but we think that they're doing very well. So I'm just gonna show why it is that we beat the top half, or we resolve a clash in top half. The other thing that I think is quite important is the weighing at the end of the clash. And I think this is the bit that people oftentimes forget when they're doing whip speeches. That sometimes, like, you'll see someone who's a whip speaker and they will sort of talk about, they will like give some responses, they will talk about their extension a bit, but then they won't do the weighing. And I think that the weighing is the most important thing, as is the meta debating. It isn't just, here is why our argument is important, but it is an explanation of why your argument is more important than other things in the round. So you must absolutely always do the last bit, like, why does this mean that our material is beating the other side? And I think also it's also something that's particularly relevant for whip speakers to do, given that extension speakers generally do not have that much time to actually do the weighing. So I think that the ending weighing is incredibly useful and incredibly important. Note, I don't think that the weighing should just be like, so overall, we think that our argument is better than the closing opposition, so we win this clash. That's not actually weighing, but it should be more like, we think that our argument applies to more people. We think that given this particular huge criticism of their argument, it cannot stand, and therefore it means that our argument gains more power. Like, there needs to be a reason for the weighing. The other tip that I would say is quite important is to maintain your structure. Structure matters. And I think that in whips particularly, it can become disastrously messy incredibly fast. So you always want to do the signposting. And I think that whips are actually a useful, like, a lot of people are like, oh, you do PMs and whips, that's kind of weird. But I think that fundamentally PMs and whips are like the most structured or should be the most structured speeches in debates. PMs, because the structure is like there, so you might as well use it. But whips, because if you don't have structure, then no one's gonna follow you, and it's gonna be terrible when you fourth, because you had the content, just like people couldn't just put it together. So I think that having structure is actually very important. Careful with your timing. I think this is important. It's very, very sad when you as a speaker get to your last clash with 30 seconds left, and that was actually the clash that was going to win you the round. So what I would say is be realistic. I know that I am terrible at getting to my last clash on time, so I never put my most important clash last, because I know that I'm not going to get to it on time. So I will always prioritize my first two clashes will be the most important ones, and then the third one is like a cherry on top, to sort of, if I get time to get to it. And always try and like set yourself times for when you like, I would say I will always try to move to my last clash when I have like at least a minute left. And I think that particularly with the timing thing, never, never, never do more than 3 clashes. I would say 2 to 3 are the acceptable numbers. 1 is like, it's not really a clash speech, it's just a stream of thought speech. And if you do more than 3, what are you doing? You're not gonna have time to go through all of them, and you're gonna spend more time going through, you know, structure than you are giving arguments. So I think 2 to 3 is like the sweet spot, depending on the round. The last one is have fun, because I do think the whip speeches are amazing, and they're generally very, very fun, and some of the more engaging speeches that you can give. So I think the whip speeches are great. So yeah, and hope that was kind of useful. I do think that practicing whip structure is something that seems unapproachable, but actually if you look at good speakers, they very frequently use this one. And I think that also practicing the whip speak structure is very good in terms of A, forcing you to be structured and improving your speech, but second, also practicing class structure will generally really, really improve your capacity to both prep and also to, in the round, make strategic decisions. So if you are someone who either wants to get better at those things, practice whips. And if you're someone who's already very good at those things, then that's probably a sign that you should be your team's whip speaker. So yeah, I guess if anyone has any questions, I'll be talking about those now. So one specific questions. Are there any good WUDC speeches you would recommend watching? Oh man. So I'm actually quite bad for video recommendations. This is going to be very vain, but I actually really rated my WUDC speech for HWS round robin, even though we lost the final, which, you know, is very fair because it was a very good opening comment. But I think that it's a good WUDC speech in terms of like showing each of the things, because, you know, like I do the structure. This is my structure that I use all the time. I would say in terms of other really good WUDC speakers that you can watch. I would say if you can find any of the recorded rounds for Thailand EUDC, Bethany Gary and Matt Hazel both whip in kind of this way. And Matt is like very mean in debates, but and kind of funny and inserts jokes. But he essentially does this. They're sort of like, they said, here's what we told you, here's why this is important. So I think that I guess those are also good speeches. But again, like I don't think that I am a particularly large source of knowledge just because I don't actually watch that many WUDCs online. I'm very bad at that for like a debate person. Most debate people know a lot of debate speeches, but yeah, so I apologize. Is it recommended to have an intro at WUDC? Yes. I think that, okay, so overall, I think maybe I'm in the minority on this, but I am very much on the speeches should have introductions. People sometimes just go like, 3 things I'm gonna talk about, but I think that that's A, not very engaging and fun, but second, and here's the most important, is that introductions aren't wastes of time. Introductions have strategic purposes, and the strategic purpose of them is because A, that's when you have the judge's attention 100%. In the middle of your speech, odds are that the probably hungover judge and the panelist who doesn't really care about you or this debate and is just doing N-1, and the other panelist who is not actually on Zoom, but is actually watching YouTube videos on the background, is not going to be paying attention to you. So the only time that you definitely have the judge's undivided, complete attention is at the beginning of your speech. So I think that given that, you should be having introductions, and you should be utilizing those introductions. So I think that when you do a WUDC speech, your introduction should be pointing out strategic flaws in the themes. It should be narrating your story. So like, panel, the reason why we have won this debate, or giving the sort of, you know, nice intro, but that actually relates to the content of your speech. So I think that having introductions is useful, precisely because they help define your story, and because it means that judges immediately go like, okay, that's what she's going to be talking about. Tell the story of how you win. Yeah, so I think that that's what I wouldn't reiterate the structure of my WUDC speech at the start. Like I wouldn't do an introduction being like 3 points of clash in today's debate. That's like the framework of my speech that goes after the intro. But as an intro, I guess it depends, right? But if CEO have really fucked up, then you start your intro being like, closing opposition is definitely out of the debate because they chose to run an insane extension, blah, 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 comment on it. But I think that in other situations, it's like, look, the most important thing in this debate is whatever, and then show how you win it. So yeah, it basically varies, but I do think that introductions are important and useful, and people should utilize them better. Any other questions? Kind of both, I would say. So the question is, do you actually take very detailed notes of what other teams say, or do you just take headline notes? I would say that if you look at my notes as a WUDC speaker, what you would find is headline notes that have random, incredibly specific bits on it, but nothing more than that random one. So I would never have the full argument in the same way that I would write it if I was judging. It's more like the headline, and then the specific sort of quick hand ways that they said that I definitely need to respond to. It's just that sometimes I would listen to something that, like, I don't know, the deputy said, and be like, that is incredibly dumb, and I'm gonna make sure to exploit that. So I would write down the specific thing. But basically, I think that the notes that you should be taking as a WUDC speaker are just enough for you to remember to respond to the big important things, but they shouldn't be individual, super detailed notes. So it's more like, here's the argument that they made, they give 3 reasons for this argument. So here, like the 3 reasons really quickly. They said this one thing that's super important to respond to. So it's, you know, quite general because you need to write it very fast. Don't waste your time writing full notes. I don't think that that's particularly helpful. And it, again, takes time from you actually thinking about the debate. Intentionally abandon the structure. Single large clash. So this is like the dream structure. I think that is a nice structure. But there's definitely been situations in which I am just like, I actually have no idea what the clashes in this debate are. And this is kind of just a disaster. So I think that in that situation, what I would do is, so I think that overall, there can be situations where you have to abandon the structure. One of them is like, who the fuck knows what the clash is? In which case, I think, or there's just one clash. Like you literally just like, look, I tried really hard, but I actually think that the only thing that people are talking about in this debate is whether or not this is going to crash the American economy. So I'm just going to talk about that for 7 minutes. In which case, I would say that you still want to kind of like maintain the sort of like, let's refute what did we say on this, etc. So you still want to have some structure, but I think that's something that you can do. The other things that I think make you kind of different to use these structures is when the opposite extension is actually quite good and you need to respond to it, in which case I would definitely, instead of doing, so for example, if I think that the extension is not very good, I would do it at the top as of my whip and be like, first responses to the extension, and just do it in like 2 minutes. But if I am like, wow, this extension is gonna like smash us, in that situation, instead of doing the first of all responses, I would just do it as a clash. So I would grab that and be like, this is a clash now, and be like, so first, a clash on whatever, war crimes, because that's the CO extension apparently, or like healthcare, and just insert all my responses there, because that means that I can spend a lot more time. Like maybe I will spend like 3.5 minutes on that instead of just like a minute as I would normally. The last thing I guess is like, if your extension didn't get very much time, again, it's very likely that you're definitely going to have a clash that is your extension or that deals with the specific things that your extension is talking about. Because if your extension is not addressing the clash, either A, what are you doing? That's a terrible extension. Or B, what are you doing? It's a bad whip if you're not talking about your extension. So I think that given that if the extension didn't get that much time, what I would instead do is I would spend quite a lot more time on the specific clash where I talk about my extension. Or, you know, if my partner just didn't give a fucking extension, in that situation, what you do is the opposite, which is you spend a lot more time on the clashes that are, you know, rebuttal and that are taking down other teams, and you're deliberately pointing out that you have destroyed them by sheer force of response, but that still means that you come over them. So yeah, I guess like class structure is quite variable, but I think that within that, the only situation in which I'd be like, I will just abandon this forever is if, again, I am like, I think there's one clash, so I'm just gonna kind of like talk about it. I've done that before, mostly because I'm quite poor at economics, so very frequently I'm like, I don't know, man, I feel like there's just one argument, so I'm just gonna talk about it for 7 minutes. The last thing is, I guess, some people find it easy to do team by team. I don't actually know. I don't actually do team by team ever, normally, ever, actually. But I think that if the debate is really, really messy and you're generally really, really struggling to find common ground and clashes, then I think that doing team by team might be beneficial. If opening theme medium analyze majority of core arguments, our extension is just a few links, ways to outweigh opening over them. Yeah, well, I think that there's sort of 2 ways that you can outweigh opening, but I think that in those situations, it's likely that you're going to take a second. And that's fine. Sometimes there aren't ways to win in BP, and that's fine, because BP isn't a game of winning, it is a game of not losing. So in that situation, what you would likely do as a web speaker is be like, whatever, we're not going to beat opening, so let's make sure that then it's an up bench. So I think that in that situation, what you'd probably do is, if you generally are like adding incredibly minor links to the existing argument, then what you want to do is you want to spend a lot more time on responses and a lot more time showing why those minor links are beating the GOP bench, even if they aren't beating their opening. So you'll probably spend more time on responses, and you'll also probably spend time explaining how your new extension additions are beating the GOP bench. the alternative thing, and the thing that I think is useful when your extension isn't minor links, but you're like actually adding stuff, it's just unclear how much you're adding to the already existing argument, is to, and here's something that I think is really important, is to be very honest about what opening government or opening opposition said. I think that the easiest way for judges to be like, derivative, is when you go, and opening op said nothing about this. And the judge is like, did they not say anything about it? Because it kind of sounded like that was their entire second argument. So I guess they did say something about it. And that's a very easy way for judges to automatically discard you, to just be like, you're just derivative. So I think what you want to do is instead be very honest and be like, look, opening op did a really good job talking about this. They said these two things. Here's what my partner is adding. And then very explicitly pointing out, she adds these two things. And then do the meta. Why is this the most important thing that my partner is adding? So I think that, again, that would probably come in like in the clash structure. You'd be like, okay, so like Gov said this, responses. So what did we tell you on the opposition bench? Overall, I think that opening up did a like solid job. They said these two things. Here's what my partner specifically added, and here's why that's the most important material in the round. So I think that, again, if you are in a situation where you're running a vertical extension, I think that you want to showcase that. And I think the best way to do that is to be very honest about what opening government or opening opposition said in the round, and be very specific and clear where you're pointing out what you're adding. Alternatively, if you genuinely in the round are like, I actually don't think that our extension is better than opening gov, we're adding like two things and they're very tiny. In that case, instead what you want to do is, although you still want to say that you're new, it's fine if you don't win and you don't beat opening government. What you still want to do is to beat the other teams. So spend more time on responses and more time showing why those few things that you add actually beat the other side. But yeah, I think that's probably about it. I also have to brush off to the lab. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone, and hope that that was a relatively useful speech workshop. And yeah, see you around the online debating world. Thank you.